Hey folks, welcome to the Aptible deploy demo. Here's a quick overview of the platform before we dive into the actual demo. Aptible deploy is a container orchestration platform as a service. It allows developers to instantly launch apps and databases that comply with even the most rigorous healthcare frameworks like HIPAA or HITRUST by automating all the required security controls needed in your infrastructure and DevOps pipeline. Now for this demo, we're going to be using a simple anonymous message board that's written in Python. I'll showcase the application code in a second. Uh, this application consists of a web service, a background worker, has Postgres and a Redis database as well. This demo would be broken down into two sections. Section one is where we're going to be covering the basics of deploy in order to help you become successful with using the platform. And section two would be giving you a quick overview of how Aptible would fit into your CI/CD workflow in order to automate the build and the deployment process. So as I mentioned, the application code that we're going to be using is a Python application that is built to create a simple message board. This is forked from a public repository that Aptible has, which we will follow up with over email with specific documentation to help you follow the same steps that we are going to be showing you in this demo. So let's start with the actual Aptible UI. So the first most basic uh, concept in Aptible is every service that is on deploy is segmented through the purview of environments. Think of environments as an organizational structure to provide for more logical isolation. I already have a few environments set up. When you first sign up for a free trial, you will not see anything over here. You'll have to create environments yourself, which you can do using this function, this button over here. And it'll ask you to choose between a shared stack, which is where your containers are deployed on infrastructure that will be shared with other customers. Typically, this is for your testing or staging environments where there's no PHI. Or you can also create environments on dedicated tenancy, where it's on private infrastructure on a fully isolated network that's dedicated to your environment. And this is where Aptible's availability SLAs apply to in the dedicated tenancy. So for this demo, I'm going to be on the shared stack, and I already have a few environments set up. Now, if you recall, I mentioned environments providing logical isolation. Now, that isolation is enforced through the roles functionality. Roles are essentially how you provide permissions for different users or different collaborators in your developer organization to different environments. So there's two permissions that Aptible Deploy provides for you, which is the manage permissions, which allows the collaborator to do anything on that environment, or just the read permission, which is, as the name implies, is just read-only permissions. So let's go back over here and actually take this application code that we have and start deploying this on deploy and show you how using deploy, you can launch applications on deploy, expose it publicly, while simultaneously ensuring that all the different controls needed for HIPAA are taken care of. So let's start by first creating the application itself. So I'm going to go to the CLI over here. Let me clear this up. Then I'm going to be using the Aptible apps create command. I'm going to be giving a name to this application that we're going to be launching. So I'm going to be calling this the demo app. And specifically, I want to be launching this or deploying this to the testing environment. So specifically, testing Aptible is the name of the environment. So I'm going to give an optional variable over here. And there you go. It's telling me that the app demo app was created. You can quickly see this through the command line itself by running Aptible apps. And this is going to show you the list of apps that exist in my account. And you'll notice over here, excuse me, that there is under the testing Aptible environment, there is the demo app over here. So let's quickly refresh go back to the UI and refresh it. And you see there's a pending app. It's pending because we haven't pushed any sort of code into this application. Now, high level, there's two different ways in which you can push new application code to deploy. There is the Docker file deploy, wherein in the application root, you can create a Docker file. And then when you push it to Aptible, Aptible will build the image on your behalf and then run the containers. Or there's also the direct image deploy. And in direct image deploy, you will be building the image and then pushing it to a container registry. From where there's a separate command called Aptible deploy, which will then take that image and then push it to deploy where it'll be run as a container. For this demo, we're going to be using the Docker file workflow, where, as I said, there's a specific Docker files present in the root of the repository over here, which is then going to be pushed to deploy, and deploy will build the image and then run it as a container. So coming back to the demo, so you'll notice that there's some steps that deploy suggests for you. So first step is adding your SSH key, which I've already done. And if you haven't done that, there'll be instructions on how to do that. We've added the Docker file already and the proc file to the application. And now all that's left is to first add the remote Aptible repository and add it as a remote to your local Git repo, and then push the code to the remote to Aptible. So let's actually do that. So let's follow the instructions over here. It's giving me the remote Aptible repo. So I'm going to add that. And then from there, it's telling me to push it to the Aptible master branch. So now, as you're seeing over here, there's some logs that are being visualized for you through the CLI. That's giving you information on the actual build process. So let's see if this gets pushed to Aptible. Here you go. So now the deploy has been successful. You're seeing that over here, and it's telling me that the app should now be on deploy. So let's go back to the UI. And you'll now see that my application now exists, and it also is giving me some additional options or configuration options for that specific application. So as I mentioned in the initial demo overview, this specific application has a background service and a web service, which you can scale independently. You can scale this either vertically or horizontally, and we'll cover that in a later section. But coming back to the configuration options, so you have services where you can scale up and down. You have endpoints, which is where we're going to be focusing our attention now, which allows you to expose your applications or databases either internally or potentially externally to receive web requests. And then there's also additional things like activity, which will give you an overview of all the different operational activity that went into your application. And then there's also security scans, where we will scan the system packages in your app Docker images to look for any sort of potential vulnerabilities. But for now, let's go back to exposing your application publicly through an endpoint. Each endpoint is a combination of an application load balancer and one or more proxies that provide for SSL termination, which in tandem expose and secure your application on the internet. So I am going to be exposing the web service over here. I'm going to be using a default Aptible endpoint. You can also bring in your own custom domain as needed, but for the sake of this demo, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to be using a managed TLS certificate by Aptible, and it's a free service that is offered on your behalf. So yeah, so as I said, so I'm going to be using the default endpoint. You can choose to have the endpoint. You can choose the placement, whether it's an external endpoint for public access or if it's an internal endpoint that is only accessible by other apps in your infrastructure. You can also set up IP filtering, but I'm not going to do any of that for now, and I'm just going to save the endpoint. So now my endpoint is being provisioned. Um, And once it's provisioned, you can actually see how the application looks on the public internet. So while the endpoint is being provisioned, if you recall, one of the things that we thought through in the initial demo overview was that this application will be using Postgres and Redis to store relational databases and queue for asynchronous worker processes. So let's actually go ahead and provision those while the endpoint is being created. So databases on deploy are automatically configured for both encryption at rest and in transit. So let's actually go ahead first and create the associated Postgres database first. And to do this, we're going to be using the Aptible db create command. I'm going to be giving a friendly handle to this database so as to differentiate this from other potential services we'll be deploying in the future. I'm going to be specifying the type over here, and I'm going to mention that it's Postgres. And the environments I will be specifying to be my test environment. Just make sure it's the right spelling. I just realized I created the name of this database as demo handle. Initially, I was thinking it would be a demo database, but looks like this is what it's going to be for now. So yeah, so while this is getting created, let's actually go back to the endpoints and see if it's what's the status on this. So it looks like it's still being provisioned. So let's go back over here. And again, as I mentioned, you will see all the different operational logs when it comes to provisioning this database over here. And it will tell you with verbose instruction messages on whether the deploy was successful, and if it failed, why it actually failed. Yep, looks like the database provisioning was successful. So now let's go ahead and do the same thing, but for our Redis database. So let's use the Aptible db create command. Let's call this demo Redis. And I'm going to be specifying the type. So this is going to be a Redis database. And the environment is going to be the test environment. So oops, looks like I had a spelling mistake over here. So yeah, so now it's going to start getting provisioned as well, just like how we provisioned the Postgres database. So while that's happening, let's go back and look at the status of the endpoints. Let's give this a little refresh to see what's happening over here. So you'll notice as the endpoint is getting provisioned that you have the host name available over here. So once the endpoint is provisioned with this host name, you can actually start to see how your application looks and behaves publicly. Because if you recall, the placement that we had defined was external placement. So coming back to our command line, it looks like the Redis database as well was successfully provisioned. So let's actually go over here and look at the databases section of the UI. So you'll notice that there's two databases that were just created. There's the Postgres database, and then there's the Redis database over here. And you'll also see immediately that there's also performance metrics that we visualize for you, which you can also send to external APM tools like Datadog as well through the metric drains option, which again, we'll cover later. So let's actually first go to the endpoint section. I realized that the endpoint was now provisioned. So let's actually, so there it is. This is the application that we are going to be working on. So there's some information on what this application does. Let's actually try it out. Let's say, hello world. You'll see that there is an error over here because it's telling us that Redis, which we had configured in our application, or we had incorporated in our application design, was not actually incorporated in the actual on deploy where it's hosted, and it's giving us this specific error. We've provisioned the different databases on deploy, but we haven't actually tied those databases to the application code. So that's what we are going to be covering now. So for this demo, we'll need to set the database URL and the Redis URL environment variables to the credential strings. We'll need. I mistakenly said that we'll be setting the URLs. We will be needing to set the URLs as environment variables to the credential strings for the two databases you created. We recommend this approach versus storing credentials directly in your application code repo in accordance with the 12-factor model. So let's actually go ahead and set these environment variables. So essentially to tell your application of the existence of these databases. So in order to do this, we will need the database credentials which in the CLI. So let's start with the Postgres database over here. So there's a section over here called credentials, which I'm going to expose. And this is the connection URL over here. So let's copy this. And then let's go back and set this as an environment variable to the command line. So in order to set environment variables, we are going to be using another command called config set. I'm going to be configuring this to a specific app, which is, in our case, it's going to be the demo app. I'm going to be mentioning the database URL. So this is the option over here, and then we're going to paste the database URL right over here. So you'll notice that when you make configuration changes, there's going to be a restarting of the application. And then when you're actually deploying, what it does is essentially what deploy promises for you is zero downtime deployments, essentially making sure that new containers or any sort of new changes only happen when the old containers, when the new containers are successfully deployed, are accepting traffic. And then the old containers, only then will the old containers get deprovisioned. All right, so looks like we had set the database URL successfully over here. So let's go ahead and change the Redis URL as well. And for the Redis URL, we're going to go back to the UI. We're going to reveal the credentials. We're going to be using the Redis plus SSL credentials over here to force SSL termination. This is just for the added layer of security. And again, this is it's gonna follow the same pattern right now. So yeah, so now that now once this is done, we've essentially told the application of the existence of these databases, and we've tied them together successfully. The next immediate step is one, our database is currently empty. So we will need to add a table which matches the application's models, which we have defined in the application code base. And to do this, we'll need to be running a database migration. So once the Redis URL has been successfully added and tied to the application, then we will be running the database migration. So there you go. So the app configuration was successfully set over here. So now let's go ahead and run the actual DB migration. So there's two ways in which you could run the DB migration. There's step one, there's one option, which is, you could log into the application shell using an ephemeral SSH session, which would create an ephemeral container that's configured identical to your app containers. So it's convenient to run any sort of management jobs or like run ad hoc jobs and so on. And in order to do that, you would essentially click Aptible SSH. You would mention that it's an app that you wanted to SSH into, and then you put in the handle of the application. But we could also automate this, because we don't want to keep doing this every time you push new code, especially when there's changes to your database schema. So in order to automate this, you can actually there's a separate file, Aptible YAML file over here. And this Aptible YAML file essentially tells deploy what are the specific functions that you will need to be, or what are the specific commands you want to be running before you actually release. So I have actually set up this before release command already on the platform. No, oh, sorry, in the code base. So now when you actually push new code to deploy, before it's actually released, it'll be running this specific command, specifically the migration command for Python. You can always like add more commands in sequential order as part of the before release step when pushing new code in Aptible. So let's actually go back and see the status of once we've done a few configuration changes. So let's go back to the application and then see how it's looking. So let's go back and say hello world. So you'll notice that we are not getting that error anymore, but we still have to make sure that the database migration actually runs. So let's actually go ahead and now push all of this to Aptible. So git push Aptible master. Yep. So now that the deployment has actually happened and the migration command was correctly executed, we can now see our application in action. So I just inserted it. You'll have to do a quick refresh to make sure the messages are displayed, and there you go. This is a quick message board that we just deployed on Aptible. And the cool thing about this is all the underlying infrastructure is complying with all the different requirements required as pertaining to HIPAA. Granted, like, we are doing this demo on a shared stack, but you can assume that that this would be the case in a dedicated stack. So let's go back now over here. So this is essentially how you would launch new applications on new application code on deploy. And this is the foundational pieces that would apply moving forward to any sort of new workflows that you configure on the platform. In addition to all the things that I've just showed you, you can also, as I mentioned before, configure log drains, where you can essentially collect your application container logs, your database logs, your SSH session logs, and any endpoint logs to different aggregators. This includes external ones like logDNA or log entries, or it could also be a self-hosted Aptible Elasticsearch wherein Aptible, you can host an Elasticsearch database on deploy and then visualize your logs through Kibana. You can also, of course, configure it manually, and we provide you with the options to do so as well for destinations that are not seen uh, or not provided to you out of the box. Then there's also metric drains. Metric drains are how you would send your performance metrics to external aggregators like Datadog. And that's pretty much it. That's the foundational pieces or the foundational pieces you'll need to know in order to be successful with Aptable Deploy. So we've covered the foundational elements of using deploy. Now let's go into the second section of the demo, which was talking about how deploy can fit into your CI/CD system. So at a high level, integrating Aptable deploy with your CI platform boils down to a few steps. One is creating a robot user in your Aptable for your CI platform that has full read-write permissions to the resources it's managing on that environment, and then triggering a deploy to Aptable deploy whenever your CI completes. So I already have a robot user. So think of it as like a dummy user of sorts. It needs to have a real email address. So let's go ahead and show you this. So I have a dummy user over here, a robot user. It has an email address. Typically, given this a demo, I've invited it to a private email, but typically most customers will use something like deploy@yourcompanydomain.com. And then depending from, you'll need to then add the SSH keys for the deploy user using that robot key, right? So if it's on a separate machine, make sure you add the SSH keys of that robot user to Aptable. And of course, to also, if because it's going to be managing your CI system, that robot user's SSH key pair will also be on GitHub and your CI system. So for my example here, I'm going to be using Jenkins, and I have Jenkins already set up. And I also have a separate app that I'm going to be using to demo the CI/CD process. Now, this demo app is exactly the same code base as the previous example of like an anonymous message board system example. So I'll just show you quickly what that endpoint looks like, or what the application looks like over here. So the only difference over here is if you'll notice, it's telling you that it's a CI/CD demo specifically. So now actually let's go to Jenkins. I have Jenkins running on my local right now. Typically this would be on a separate server that is accessible over the internet. I have added the required repositories. So in my case, I have a private app repository, and I've added the associated credentials to access this through SSH. I've also added the Git URL associated with Aptable. So that Git URL you can always find directly in the applications section of deploy. And I've added that as a remote, and I've also added the credentials here. And I've also specified over here what specific remote name is associated with this. From here, I've added a few post-build actions. And one is I've made sure that it only pushes new code when the build succeeds. So this way, if you're having any sort of tests that are running as part of your CI system, you can ensure that only healthy code that's passed all those tests get pushed. And I've also specified what is the exact name, what is the remote it has to be pushing to. In our case, we want to be pushing it to the master branch of Aptable when the build succeeds. So let's actually go ahead and make a few changes. So this is the application code of the CI project I just showed you. So let's go ahead and say, make a change to the header. Let's say CICD system used for demoing for demo purposes, right? So I've just added a change to the messaging, a simple change. Let's go ahead and commit this change. So let's clear this. let's commit. Let's first add the stage changes. Let's messaging. And then I'm going to push this to my origin, which is a private GitHub repository. So let's wait for that to get pushed. Yep, looks like it's been pushed successfully. So now let's, instead of pushing it to deploy, we want to talk about incorporating this as part of your automated system, right? So because it's running on my local, let me just go ahead and actually build this project. So I'm going to click build now. And you'll see that a build was just scheduled. So let's go over here. The build is happening. Let's look at the console output to see what's happening. So as this is happening, let's go to deploy and see what's happening over here. So you'll notice that the robot user is actually deploying now, as and this deployment was triggered as part of the build process that we had configured on Jenkins. And of course, Aptible will make sure it passes all those required checks in order to before it releases the application. Namely, it makes sure that it executes all the before release commands we have configured in the Aptible YAML file. It makes sure that the application is the new containers are responding to health checks before it deprovisions the old ones. And make sure that the application load balancers were successfully registered. And only then is the application going to be exposed, is going to replace the old containers. So this way you're ensuring that there is high availability and we're meeting our SLA requirements. So this is a quick overview of how you would be incorporating Aptible into your CI system. This is of course a very quick, a simple demo, but really with the power of Aptible, the associated CLI commands, and the configuration flexibility that is offered in CI systems like Jenkins or Travis, you can configure deploy to meet most of your automated deployment needs. Looks like the system has successfully deployed. So let's actually go ahead and see if the changes are now live. There you go. Changes are now live. All right, folks. So thank you so much for taking the time to see this demo. Let me know your thoughts.